If you're a global company or investor looking to navigate a world defined by a pandemic and a fracturing global economy, you need a different kind of advice.
So we are now on to surely the biggest, or one of the biggest topics in FT land, and not just in FT land. We're going to turn to China. Working title of this session, Who's Afraid of Xi Jinping? This, of course, is a story with many facets. It's a subject that it's political. We'll be looking at internal Chinese politics and the increasing control that Xi has been having over the country. It's geopolitical, the great rift or growing rift between America and China after decades in which they seem to be coming closer together. There's a regional political element in terms of Hong Kong, the clash in the Himalayas. It's a financial story, it's an economic story, it's a social story, it's just everything. So I think we've got a pretty good panel for this one.
Yeah, we brought out the heavy hitters, as you need for a story with that many aspects. So we have the FT chief economics commentator, the one and only Martin Wolf. We've got FT Deputy Beijing Bureau Chief, Yuan Yang,
who has written a lot for us this year on China.
She has, most recently a great cover story for the magazine about China's bid to end rural poverty completely, which was absolutely incredible.
Did she have the answer?
Well, I mean, they're doing quite well, but their methods are a little bit on the shaky side. And of course, FT's chief foreign affairs commentator, Gideon Rachman. So that's it on the FT side, but we also have, Alec.
Well, we also have Nada Moussavidzadeh, who I've known quite a long time. He is the chief executive of Macro Advisory Partners, the chief sponsor of the festival. But I first knew Nada long before his FT link via Kofi Annan, because we were both, I think it's even fair to say, close to Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, and Nada helped me a lot over the years when I was writing about Kofi and his legacy. Well, now, of course, he's running Macro Advisory Partners, and he also, like the others, has big thoughts on China. So over to you, Gideon.
Hello, and welcome to everybody who's watching this session on China, and thanks to all the panel for joining me, mainly from London, but Yuan also in Beijing. Let's get straight into it. Nada, this is obviously an incredibly tense moment in US-Chinese relations for all sorts of reasons. Some people hope that it is just a moment, that it's associated with the presidential election and that things can calm down again afterwards. How serious do you think the current breakdown in US-Chinese relations is?
Thank you, Gideon. Well, I think it's important to recognize that however serious the current situation is, and it is a serious one, and arguably it would be much more serious if we were not 2 months from a presidential election, and maybe we'll get to that when we speak later about the differences between a Biden and Trump policy. But I think it's important to step back and recognize that while it is serious now, it is the beginning. We are on the early stages of a long-term structural transformation in the relationship between the United States and China. And it's really driven by two main changes and a third, which is very much related to this year of 2020. The first change is that there is a fundamental shift that is now confirmed and established in the view of the United States in thinking about China not as a competitor, but as an adversary. That view is bipartisan. It encompasses now much of the business community, and it is not going to change regardless of who wins in November. Basically, every dimension of the US-China relationship in the United States, and certainly the view of the United States government, is refracted through the lens of security, and by this administration, through the lens of an ideological view of China as a fundamentally adversarial power whose rise must not just be attenuated or slowed, but actually stopped. The second important change, and I think this is just as important, even though it may not be recognized as often in the West, is the change in China's own view of its role, its domestic politics, a China that has reformed and closed rather than reformed and opened, a China whose leadership is more authoritarian, is more concentrated around one man's leadership vision, and a China that is much less shy about its ambitions, not just in Asia or around the world. And that is China that in more explicit ways than it would have done in the past is looking to challenge the United States as the world's leading power. And finally, the third change, and I think this is an important one given that we're sitting here in early September in the year of the pandemic, is of course that the relative difference in the experience of China and the United States of the pandemic is a very, very powerful signal to the rest of the world. And I think particularly not of Europe, but much of the rest of the world that has looked to the experience of China, the way it has managed the pandemic versus the way the United States has managed it. Think just of the basic numbers here, that from January till the 5th of September, basically in the United States, there have been some 10 million cases confirmed of COVID and some 280,000 deaths, while at the same time in China, a country 4 times the population, you've had around 90,000 confirmed cases and 5,000 deaths. And that's even if you allow for some of the skepticism that we have about the data coming from China, even if it's 3 or 4 multiples of that. That change, I would say, Gideon, is an important one also through which much of the rest of the world. My colleague Ivan Krastev likes to say that hegemony, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. To much of the rest of the world, this example of how China has managed the pandemic versus how the United States has managed the pandemic, I think will also set some deep roots for how the relationship goes forward.
Okay, thanks. That's a very comprehensive start to the conversation. So Martin, if I can come to you next. I mean, you've written books about globalization, and it seems to me that at the center of this whole process of globalization, which has shaped the world, was the US-Chinese relationship. These are the 2 largest economies in the world. It was America's opening to China that really kind of set the process in train. If that's breaking down now, does that mean that globalization as we know it is gone?
Well, I don't know whether it's gone, but it's certainly going. And I think it's useful, before we get into the details of the relationship now, to look back a little on the history of globalization, which actually I discussed in some detail in the book I wrote almost 20 years ago on globalization. And it will help, I think. Basically, the way to think about globalization is there are 2 profound forces which determine integration of economies. The first is obvious, it's technology. And pretty consistently over the human history, actually, but certainly over the last 2 centuries, the technologies that allow us to trade intensively, to move people, goods, information has improved. It's improved in jumps, and there were in some ways even more important jumps in the 19th century than in the last 100 years. But generally, clearly, the technology has improved. So you would expect, other things being equal, and they aren't, for our economies to become more integrated across border over time. And if you compare 1850 to today, that would be correct, big time. But, and this is the second force, of course, what actually happens in the short term, and by the short term, I mean 40 or 50 years or so within that cycle, is determined by politics and political relationships. Before the First World War, there was a massive period of globalization in all forms. Then there was 30 years of disintegration. Then there was the period which I think of as the Western integration under the Pax Americana in the West till about 1980. Then there was full globalization, which I don't think of as US-China, but I think of as the rest of the world joining the Western system economically. And that was reached, then generated globalization on all fronts except movement of people, migration, to a greater degree than ever before. In the last 10, 12 years since the crisis, it's sort of been very troubled. And now with politics breaking down, I think we're at the beginning of a new breakdown period comparable to the period from the First World War to the end of the Second World War. Whether it will be that bad, I don't know. But it's these 2 forces that will determine where we go. And I think at the moment, politics is clearly going to be primary.
Okay, well, we'll look later on in the conversation into how that's going to play out. But Ewan, I'd like to bring you in from Beijing. I mean, Nada described a lot of the forces that are driving this from the United States. The US's change in its view of China. How do people in Beijing and in China generally see this. I'm talking mainly about the leadership, but also, if you like, the man in the street, the man and woman in the street. What do they think of this apparently more hostile United States?
Yes, we can look at this question from the perspective of various different people. I think for the entrepreneurial classes, for the intellectual classes, there's a great deal of blame for the current leadership in the role that they've played in aggravating and worsening the US-China relationship. If you think of people like the leadership of ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok, there was a sense, at least when 10 years ago, that by this stage, China would be a modern economy, that if you were an entrepreneur in China in technology or any other field that had an international reach, you too could play on an international playing field with the rest of the world. And that dream has been completely shattered by the US sanctions over the last year. So on the one hand, among, let's say, the intellectual class, the middle class, there is a sense in which, because of the way that the leadership has handled its relationship with the US, they have lost opportunities and there's a great deal of blame. On the other hand, I think for the leadership itself, it's looking at more immediate domestic concerns. And in a way, you can think that for Xi and for the Communist Party, the only real problems are domestic problems, the way in which in the long run, a worsening relationship with the US and with China's major trade partners might continue to drag on the Chinese economy and get rid of the opportunities that we thought there could be for moving away from this investment-led, debt-based economic growth model. And that leap towards technological upgrading and towards increasing the kind of value that China puts into its exports is extremely threatened by the amount of distrust that China has now shown in its relationships.
And are they concerned also by the more purely strategic stuff, these rising tensions over Taiwan, jostling in the South China Sea? Is that of a real concern for the leadership, do you think?
So I think, again, the concern is best instead of domestic. There is a very organic group of nationalists, both within the party and within the mass support for the Communist Party. And if Xi and if the Communist Party says we have red lines about, for example, Taiwan, about Hong Kong, and on Tibet and Xinjiang and so on, and if there are countries seem to start to push those red lines, for example, through, for example, if the US were to continue patrolling in a way very close to where China sees its territory ending, then there'll be calls towards leadership for, why are we not defending ourselves more robustly? Why are we seemingly giving in to this? And so in a way, I would see those kinds of concerns, partly, as the leadership's own sincere concerns and its ideological concerns, but also as a way of trying to reassure the support it has among a mass base of people who were told all along that the Communist Party is strong, that China is strong, and it will not bend down to foreign aggression. So I think for those strategic concerns, a lot of them are also about domestic propaganda.
Nada, you said something quite interesting in your initial remarks where you were saying, which slightly surprised me, you thought it would be actually even worse without the presidential election, which doesn't make one feel too optimistic about 2021. Would you like to expand on that?
Sure. I think if you look at the set of measures that the United States government in particular has taken over the last year, we've had weeks where on a daily basis, new entities have been added to various sanctions lists, export control measures, the Huawei story, which we may discuss later, TikTok, the sanctions against Carrie Lam, the ban on WeChat. All these measures, I think, would, in an environment where we were not 2 or 3 months away from an election, be seen as much, much more serious by the Chinese leadership. By which I mean there is a discount that is being applied because we are at a moment, 2 months now, less than 2 months, from a US election whose outcome is probably as consequential as any for the last 50 years for a whole range of issues, but certainly for the US-China relationship as well. I think if you think about the possible outcomes then and why I say that things would be possibly worse were we not 2 months from it, is that I think China is looking very carefully at what will come next. And I think there, if you look at the future alternative between a Biden and a Trump policy, I think the first thing to think about is if Trump is reelected, how will he approach China on his first day in office as the newly inaugurated president in January? I think, first of all, he will come to office believing that the Chinese did everything they could to get Biden elected. So he will come in with a very negative view of China, first of all. Second of all, he will come with a view that he has been vindicated by his re-election, by the mandate from the American people in taking a very different approach to China. Third, I think we should assume that his initial view early in this administration, that he wanted to do some grand deal with China, that he wanted to be recognized by Xi Jinping as a great leader, just as he wanted to recognize him as a great leader. I think that motivation will fall away. And I think the hardliners on the ideological and national security front will be even more free to take measures. And that's alongside the economic and trade measures. If you look at people like Lighthizer and Navarro, the principal trade advisors to Trump, they too will believe that they have been vindicated in a view of international trade, which is about blowing up the existing economic and trading system and establishing a much more transactional one. So I think we are in for a much more difficult and enhanced set of Trump measures against China, to which China, of course, will respond. In the event that Biden wins, I think it's important to recognize that we will have more continuity than change. That has a lot to do with the structural shift in the basic fundamental consensus in Washington that I mentioned before, but it is also to do with what you might call a holy or an unholy alliance in the Democratic Party, where there will be people on the left who will be focusing much more on the human rights and labor standards issues, which have not been priorities for this administration, and they will combine with the national security team around Biden, who will look at all the areas that Yuan just mentioned, Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea, and on all those measures, will look to take a fairly tough line on China. So you look then at a Biden team that will come in. Yes, it'll be less volatile. Yes, it'll be less policy by tweet, by whim. But because they will come to office with this broadly similar view as needing to attenuate China's rise and its ability not just to rise as a global power, but also influence things like technology standards and multilateral organizations, they will do it in a way that might seem less confrontational, but actually they will come to it with a fundamental view as follows. They believe that the current administration is pursuing a policy of confrontation without competition, and they want to put in place a policy that is about competition without confrontation. And the way they will do that, finally, is that they will come to office with a view that one of the most important correctives to this administration is to institutionalize policy. They believe that they will come to office, they will institutionalize, systematize, legislate, bureaucratize, and very importantly, alliance base the policy towards China. They will come to Europe and make a very different proposition to Europe. They will happily give Europe what Europe most wants, which is a renewed security guarantee versus Russia and commitment to NATO, and a commitment to the European Union, in return for which my suspicion is that Europe will be more willing to join that values-based, multilateral, transatlantic new policy towards China.
Okay, so I think in different ways, both of those approaches that you outline imply further separation of the two economies. And something that you sometimes hear from businessmen, Martin, is that, well, you know, there's going to be a limit to how far this can go, because actually the two economies are so integrated now that politicians don't really know what they're doing. They will discover that they're doing such economic damage that they'll have to step back. What do you think about this, that argument that this idea of delinking the two economies is in the end going to just be impractical?
There was a view which is very famous, that wasn't quite this simply minded, put forward by a very famous book by a man called Norman Angell, before the First World War, that, and essentially the proposition was a conflict would be suicidal and ruinous. And most people think, he also said, but certainly many people then believed, that therefore it wouldn't happen. So I happen to think that the business people are right, that completely separating our economies would create very, very large short to medium run costs. And short to medium run here are many years. But that doesn't mean it won't happen, because politics gets its own nationalist politics gets its own momentum in situations like this, and that's what happened. I mean, we had a very highly integrated world economy in 1914. We didn't get back to that on many measures till 1980. Think about it. So some measures more, some less. So the deglobalization can happen. That's the first point. The second point, I think Nada made some very important point about the differences between the two, because I think an important dimension of this, a lot of the trade China does, and obviously a lot of the trade the US does, but it trades less, it's less open. A lot of the trade China does, most of it is not with the US, it's with the world. With Europe is, if I remember correctly, a more important trading partner overall than the US. Certainly very close. I think it's more important. And of course, it does a vast amount of trade in the Asian region. And so from their point of view, the really important question is what happens to all that? The technology side is very important with the US, and they've shown that on the Huawei case, and we'll come back to that perhaps. But the really big question is, where does everybody else fit in? I think the Trump approach, which is bilateral, will make it very difficult for everybody else, but I think everybody else will, in that situation, work desperately hard to avoid taking sides. And so far, that's what's really happened. It's been a US-China war. If it's the Biden approach, I think he's got a very good chance of creating a coalition, including Europe. And the really interesting thing is, will he be able to get that coalition to include Japan and other East Asian countries? If he does, then the Chinese really are in a squeeze. And that's back to the strategy that the Obama administration was pursuing with the TPP. So there are some really interesting strategies. If I were the Chinese, I think I would be more worried about an effective Biden strategy, which is a replication, of course, of the Cold War strategy, the Soviet Union, than the Trump strategy, which has actually been economically surprisingly undamaging to them in the last 4 years.
Well, that's set up Yuan very nicely. So, I mean, are the Chinese more worried about the Biden strategy? And more broadly, how vulnerable do you think they feel? Because we've heard several references already to Huawei and this suggestion by some that the United States might actually be in the business to inflict a mortal wound on a flagship Chinese company. Do the Chinese feel vulnerable, or do they think in the end, are they reasonably confident they can ride this out?
I think China is incredibly vulnerable to more sanctions, especially if there are more of China's chip makers and other companies that supply Huawei that come under the knife as well and start being sanctioned by the US. So no, I think people in China within Huawei, within the government, within the think tanks that advise the government are rightly concerned. There was a long-term plan to decouple, to build tech self-sufficiency, and that was a plan that could have been achieved in decades, if at all. Now that the sanctions have come, it's far too fast for China to accelerate that plan. And so we see Huawei and the companies that China was betting on to power a new kind of high-tech economy, those are the companies that are really in threat. But I think Martin's completely right about the threat of a Biden presidency to the Xi administration, because in a funny way, Trump has been a great morale booster in China for the Chinese people and for supporters of the Communist Party. It's very easy to point at Trump and the things that he does and the laws and the executive orders that he rushes out and say, look at this haphazard presidency that's clearly out to get China, that clearly has no respect for process and is not operating on any kinds of principle. Because it's very easy, again, to analogize that to a Chinese system in which there really is no process, and a lot of it is realpolitik. It's playing with the power against your opponents. So in many ways, the aggression of Trump towards China and his whole persona has really helped build President Xi's case for why he and the Communist Party is the right approach to ruling in China. And the coronavirus has, as Nada says, somewhat accelerated that view as well in China. But as my fellow panelists point out, the nexus here is Europe and what Europe can do with a potentially more planned out, more cooperative Biden presidency. in many of the cases in which sanctions have been made against Huawei, against other Chinese tech companies, not only has the US business community been thrown under the bus by the Trump administration, but the US has also been very happy to throw European partners, for example, ASML, the chip equipment manufacturer in the Netherlands, also under the bus. And increasingly, when I speak to European business people and diplomats in Beijing, they also voice the view that they too could become the collateral damage of unplanned sanctions that were never really thought out.
Just a quick follow-up on that one. I'm slightly surprised as this unfolds by how technologically vulnerable China is, because they've, in some respects, it's always seemed to me as an increasingly technologically sophisticated society with a lot of research going on. Are they just incapable at this stage of making their own chips?
Well, so the straightforward answer to that is yes. And to make that kind of more symmetrical, let's say that that's also the case for any large economy. The US is also extremely vulnerable to a fractured trading relationship with China, with other Asian partners and European partners, because of the nature of the chip supply chain. It's not done in one place. And in fact, the semiconductor industry is a great example over the last few decades of how minutely specialized and extremely globalized an industry can become, all the way from the software where the chips are designed, to the equipment and the materials that the chips are made from, to the actual plants and factories that manufacture the chips. All of that is spread out all across the world. So yes, China is an incredibly technologically advanced country now in 2020, but it is still behind the US in certain crucial parts of the chip supply chain. And even if it were to have the US's capabilities, the US couldn't go on its own in terms of a semiconductor industry either. It would have to have Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, it would have to have European partners and so on. So no one country can do this alone.
Okay.
I think the crucial point is that just and it's a point I made in several columns, I'd be very interested in that view. If China gets into an economic war with the West and its allies, including Japan and South Korea, the whole of Europe and North America, China is hopelessly outgunned at the moment on the economics. I think it's very important to understand that. In the US-China conflict, it's still outgunned substantially, but it has more freedom of maneuver.
Yeah. Maybe, should I just respond to that, Gideon?
Please, and then I've got a bigger question I'd like to pose to you, but go for that first.
Yuan brilliantly just set out, I think, one of the key dimensions of thinking about this relationship in the future as being driven and determined by very different factors than we would have traditionally thought. This is a competition that will not be determined on a battlefield of conventional weapons or even military weapons. This is hugely going to be determined by who wins the war in AI, who wins the war on the broader technology piece, because that will be central not just to being a central actor in the global economy, but to the kind of social and state governance that both societies are looking for. I think it's really important to think about one aspect of what Yuan said, which is the Taiwanese case. The case of Taiwan, of course, is very unique in that TSMC is such a singular player in the global semiconductor industry with hugely consequential ties to big US companies and a very important supplier to Huawei as well. And so figuring out where that country and that company ends up is something I think we should all pay attention to. Where to Martin's question about, I think, where the Chinese, I think there's no doubt that China had three big surprises when Trump was elected. They were surprised he won. Now, so was he, so you can forgive them for that. I think they are also surprised to see this consensus shift in Washington. And there, I think that's a less forgivable surprise because they were speaking, I think, too much to people who were too invested in the old kind of relationship. And then the third surprise was seeing the United States willing to use every instrument of the US government to go after a national champion like Huawei with an absolute determination to destroy that company. That, I think, yes, will have set back some of the ways in which China is going to be able to catch up and advance its chip industry. However, it has also accelerated, of course, this determination. And whatever debate there was in Beijing at the time about more cooperation, more integration versus greater emphasis on indigenous development, that debate ended with the Huawei case. And I think that's what we should be looking for. Finally, I would say on people, and maybe we'll talk about this, keep in mind, if you are an American technology company today and you're looking to hire the best AI scientists, the best machine learning scientists, the best engineers in the broader tech industry, you are looking more often at China than anywhere else in the world, including the United States. You may not be able now to bring those engineers to the United States, but you're therefore hiring them in China still, because China is developing extraordinary human capacity on that front.
Yeah, which I suppose raises the question is how long is that going to be possible? In fact, I remember talking to a leading American tech entrepreneur maybe a couple of years ago, and him saying, rather presciently as it turned out, that he was worried it was getting to the situation where he would no longer be able to hire the world's best talent because the Americans would forbid him from hiring Chinese nationals. But which raises, I suppose, brings us to a broader question I'd like to put on the table, which is this metaphor of the Cold War, the new Cold War, which is everywhere. I'd be interested in your views, not least because I've been asked by the FT to write an article about this. So if you can get me going, that would be great. Do you think it's a useful concept, Nada?
I don't think it's a very useful concept for a couple of fundamental reasons. I don't think we are dealing, we, the West, I should say, is dealing with the Chinese state and the Chinese economy with any of the limitations that the Soviet Union had, even when people imagined the Soviet Union to be much stronger than it turned out to be on every possible dimension. China fundamentally does not pose an ideological challenge to the United States as much as it does a different kind of economic actor and a different kind of economic partner to so much of the rest of the world. And we can maybe talk about how the vaccine question is going to impact this as well. I think the real way to think about this competition, and there are ways to think of it in a more pessimistic or more optimistic way, is nonetheless a competition that is about achieving dominance in the key technology areas, and then depending very much on what kind of policy the United States takes after November. Do you have a world in which the United States is building alliances and values-based alliances in its view of contesting China's dominance and contesting China's activity in some of these security areas? And how is China responding? And there I would just underscore how much the pandemic has accelerated in the views of many countries around the world China's reaffirmation of its model domestically, the legitimacy of the party being successful in managing the pandemic, and externally as being the actor that sooner than many others was out there providing PPE. And if you speak to leaders in much of the world, they've essentially concluded that they will not have access to a Western vaccine in the first 12 months that it is available in the West, but much sooner will have access to a Chinese vaccine. And that, of course, if we are going to live in an age of pandemics, plural, will be a world in which China will establish very key relationships with a range of countries who will look to China as the country that came to them in their hour of need.
Although, of course, the pandemic started in China. So, I mean, it's a kind of strange move from being the arsonist to being the firefighter.
That makes this jiu-jitsu even more extraordinary to see taking place.
Yeah. Martin, I mean, narrowing it down a bit, I guess in the old Cold War, the US was not entirely virtuous or blameless, but it could argue that it, with a straight face, that it represented the free world and so on. How concerned are you that the political and ideological developments in America sort of make that kind of pitch to the rest of the democratic world much harder?
Much, I think. And Nada has already discussed one dimension of that. First of all, I agree completely that the conflict is fundamentally different. It's more like a great power rivalry of the sort of late 19th, early 20th century type with imperial zone aspects, but with a sort of political edge to it. And, you think about the German state and the British state in 1900, they had some pretty obvious similarities. They were both market economies integrated in many ways, but of course politically different too. I mean, the German Reich was run on a different line. So it seems to me more like that. And that means thinking about how we handle it, how the West, if it exists, will handle this is going to be helpful to forget a lot of the Cold War stuff. But in the Cold War, apart from its enormous economic superiority and technological superiority, at least vis-a-vis the Soviet Union most of the time in much of the world, the West had some very important ideological assets, though there was, of course, a not insignificant communist movement. And then what were these ideological assets? They were seen as competent, not necessarily very nice, but they're competent. The Americans were seen as anti-colonialist, which is quite important. We tend to forget this. They dismantled the empires. They were seen as open societies. And, you know, in all things said, liberal democracy was rather attractive. These were important assets. Now, how does it look now? Well, we seem to have lost faith in our own political system. Donald Trump is a living exemplar of that. I mean, he makes it clear almost every day. The Western system has broken down, and we seem egregiously incompetent. And Nada is utterly right, I think, on just how bad the Western performance, and it's not just America, much of Europe is just as bad, has been in managing this challenge. Technologically, we seem to be losing our edge, even if it isn't yet lost. And for the rest of the world, this doesn't look very impressive or very attractive. And so why not get on the side that's winning? And now, there are, well, what Nada said, and he's utterly right about vast parts of the world. There are, of course, quite important countries who might well be thinking, actually, countries are a really serious threat. We better get into this Western side. India is one I'm very interested in that way. But I think we are in a competition stroke, conflict stroke rivalry, which we have not in the West seen in our lifetimes, and it's going to be really very difficult. And handling this in a sensible way is going to be very, very difficult. And it's clear that up to now, in the last few years, we've made a pretty spectacular mess of it.
Okay, Ewan, I mean, how is this Cold War analogy seen in Beijing? Is it discussed much? And if the world is dividing to some extent into sort of pro-American and pro-Chinese camps, how well placed do you think the Chinese feel? Do they feel confident they can bring a lot of people along with them?
I think the problem with the Cold War metaphor from both China's point of view and also for the US is that a Cold War is actually not possible. And because of the economic entanglement of China and the US and the rest of the world, the attempts to decouple from China on the part of the US have actually led to so many bad consequences for businesses across the world, including Chinese businesses. So the issue I think I have with the Cold War metaphor is that it paints the idea that it is possible to have an iron curtain. It is possible to have disengagement politically or economically. And China today is far more integrated into the rest of the world than Russia was during the Cold War. And so it is not possible. In fact, having that vision, I think, creates this false idea that decoupling can get us to a safer world. And if you look at the example of technology, which is what I cover in Beijing, China makes more than half of the rest of the world of the rest of the world's smartphones. China makes 1/5 of the whole world's personal computers, and that's not even to talk about the components that come from China and that are embedded in every single laptop and every single smartphone and every device that our readers are using to listen to us right now. There are Chinese components, there is Chinese technology, and it's very difficult to separate that supply chain out, which leads us to the issue of if there are some within the US administration or other governments pushing for a Cold War approach to China, what does that actually look like in the end? And I doubt that anybody has actually mapped out a plan or a strategy for what that kind of level of disengagement would look like.
Okay. There's a few questions coming in from the audience. One for you again, Ewan. I think primarily it says, what made China introduce new security laws in Hong Kong? And to what extent will this affect Hong Kong's status as a major financial center?
I mean, obviously, this question is one that's greatly affected a lot of my interviewees and also my colleagues and other journalists in Hong Kong, who now feel that Hong Kong is no longer a place where they can exercise freedom of speech and is a place that is unsafe for them to remain. When you ask why it introduced the national security law, which is a very wide-ranging law that punishes all sorts of speech, including people who might argue for Hong Kong's independence, but also just looks at this moment to be used as a political suppression law. I think the answer is that Beijing is genuinely concerned about the idea of separatism or independence movements in Hong Kong, and is also concerned about the idea that there might be a growing movement against Hong Kong's leadership, and saw actually this year as a very easy one in which it could strike without much damage to itself domestically and also in terms of its international reputation. The rest of the world is dealing with an epidemic right now, and domestically within China, the ability of people to criticize leadership, given the recovery that China's made, has also been the recovery that China's made from the epidemic has also been lessened. So I think the answer is that China wanted to do this all along, and this was the right moment to strike.
Yeah, another question that's come in from the audience, I mean, I guess both Nada and Martin, you might have views on this, is that if there is an attempt at decoupling and at a new Cold War, is America's trump card the dollar? Is that the thing, access to the global financial system, that is the biggest threat that they can pose to China? Nada, what do you reckon?
Sure. Let me start just by picking up one thing Yuan said about the still deep entanglement of the Chinese economy with the global economy and the US economy. I think that's absolutely right. What I also think we should recognize is that the Trump policies on tariffs, as well as the broader performance of American companies in China, just take the auto sector where there's not a single American company in the top 10 selling cars in China anymore. If you take those two factors and the way in which the tariffs have genuinely had an impact on US businesses, strategies and supply chains and manufacturing base in China, accelerating the move out of China and closer to the United States or the Americas, what we are seeing, though, is an economic trend that will actually accelerate the de-integration. We're seeing this separate from, in some ways, pushed by these policies like tariffs, but I don't think we should underestimate, despite the long tail that there will be on some of these big relationships and these big technology and other manufacturing bases. I think it's important to realize that the tariffs are having an impact. And by the way, Joe Biden will not be lifting the tariffs anytime soon, if ever, and probably only in the context of a negotiation with the Chinese. When it comes to the dollar, it's a very good question. There's no doubt that one of the achievements of the United States in the last 20 years has been to weaponize the international financial system as a key instrument of American power. It's in part a function of the failure of some of America's hard power tools, if you look at Iraq or Afghanistan, and increasingly, therefore, sanctions. And the dominance of the international financial system and the centrality of the dollar has become the go-to move. There's no doubt that this administration has at very senior levels considered breaking Hong Kong's peg to the dollar as a way of punishing China, they think. Now, there's a debate about whether it actually would. But that use of the dollar and the power of the dollar, I think we should expect will continue for some long time. There have been lots of predictions that the euro or maybe the renminbi would challenge the dollar, and we're seeing very little evidence of that. What I do think is the case, and this is very much something I learn from Martin about every time he writes and we talk about this, I do think, however, what's called the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar, that arc of the US dollar's dominance and use as an instrument of American power, that arc can be bent. It can be bent through misuse. It can be bent through abuse. It can be bent by the use of it on sanctions without the kind of alliance that I think a Joe Biden would put in place. Having said that, I think it is a very long time until the dollar will not remain the core currency of global trade. In fact, one of the reasons we're seeing some distorting effects of currency movements is that so much of trade, even between countries that don't involve the United States, is increasingly in the dollar. However, this use of sanctions, if that accelerates, I think will bend the arc of America's dominance in the international financial system over a long period.
Yeah, Martin, I'd love to get your view on that. I mean, some will say, maybe a bit hopefully in Moscow and Beijing, yeah, but, America's abusing this. Eventually the world's going to get sick of it. Plus the Americans are running this vast deficit. they're going to trip up eventually, and the dollar's dominance is not there forever.
I think there are so complicated, and I thought Yuan's points was also so important. Thinking about where we're going and what it might mean is it really is very complicated because it's such a multi-sided game. I think the US dollar and its other assets continue to give it very, very substantial leverage over much of the world in different ways. It has, for example, this is not as huge security leverage over Europe. It has the dollar leverage over almost every country that is integrated into the world financial system. Latin America, Africa, even South Asia, though less so. And that's pretty powerful. It's the dominant world currency. It has been so since the Second World War, and it's not going to end very soon. That's a tremendous leverage everywhere. And of course, it has technological leverage, as it's shown. So it's a tremendously powerful country. And that allows it to form alliances. And then there's the ideological side. It allows it to form alliances more or less willingly, as you saw, or break them, with countries all over the world. Just look how it dealt with Europe over Iran. Now, the second question is, how much does that allow it to dictate to China? And my own view is, to some degree, but to a limited degree. That is to say, and limited by limited I mean it can damage China significantly, and it will damage itself in the process. But I doubt very much whether it can stop China. Now, that's a really big question. And the dollar certainly can't. The Chinese financial system is essentially independent of the dollar. The Chinese financial system essentially intermediates domestically. And where it doesn't intermediate domestically, it sends money except for the dollar reserves, which of course it could in theory lose. That would be a real nuisance. But apart from the dollar reserves, it's sending its capital to countries with which it has really quite close relations, Central Asia and all the rest of it. So I think the Chinese economy could continue to function, even if the dollar were weaponized. And I also think the trade shock will be terrible, but it will be both sides. And I think if the Chinese, given that they invest 40-45% of GDP, they have this staggering manpower, which we've already talked about. If the country was mobilized fully and totally for self-sufficiency, I wouldn't bet against them. And that's, I think, where they might go. So the relationship with China becomes very, very complicated, it seems to me, if the Chinese are persuaded that this is all-out war.
Okay, well,
let me pick up on something that Martin said there and break down what it means to stop China. I think there are so many different issues under this heading. Can we stop China from conducting economic espionage, stealing trade secrets from other countries? Can we stop the long reach of the Chinese government from pressuring Chinese students abroad from speaking their mind and feeling safe on campus? Can we stop China from spying on the communications of my friends in the US or my family in the UK? I think the answer to all of these questions is potentially yes, but I don't see how under any one of those issues, anybody is safer now under the Trump presidency and after a year and almost 2 years of trade tensions with China than they were before, because the instrument that would be used to solve these issues is so different from the instruments that are being used right now.
So, Ewan, we've got 3 minutes left, so just time to throw another huge unanswerable question to you before we wrap up, which was posed by one of our readers. He says, watchers, is China's highly autocratic decision-making process key to its competitiveness, or wouldn't a more open society be more attractive to young, brilliant Chinese minds? You've got 3 minutes for that, 64 minutes.
Yeah, it's funny. I just returned to Beijing from a few weeks in Sichuan, which is over 1,000 kilometers from the capital. And once you leave Beijing, you realize how much people who are university educated, who've been outside of China, and not just them, but also people who've suffered pressure from the government that they see as unfair, how how much they can also mock the government. As much as it's not allowed and not permitted to do so online or in the mass media, Chinese people speak their own minds when the government is far away, when the emperor is far, and the hills are high, as the saying goes. So I think the answer to your question is clearly yes. People are very aware of the opportunities that have been lost from not having more flexible government, a more open government where one can speak one's mind. And the way that the Wuhan government dealt with the early stage of the outbreak in late December and early January is just a stark example of where too many whistleblowers were shut down and the whole world has suffered as a result. However, I think the Communist Party has done an amazing job of gaslighting the Chinese people. A very frequent thing you'll hear after you hear somebody grumble about the autocratic government is they'll then go on to say, oh, but Chinese people were too rowdy and we cannot be governed by anything other than a dictator. And that's something that you hear from all across, I think, the class and educational divides. And it is a lie that the Communist Party has continued to tell the Chinese people.
Yeah, well, it's the question of the next 20 years, I guess, how this ideological and political developments develop. So I'm sure we'll have further sessions on this, but we're coming to the end of this one. So Ewan, it was wonderful that you could join us from Beijing. Thank you so much. Nada, thanks to you for all your contributions and also for the role that Macro Advisory Partners have played in making this whole festival possible. It's much appreciated. And Martin, thanks for joining us. I think you're on book leave at the moment, but I hope you're going to be back in the pages of the FT soon. When are we going to get you back in?
Sometime in October.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks to all of you. And
everything will be resolved.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to all of you. And from me, back to the FT Weekend Studio.
Well, welcome back, Claire.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to Gideon and Nada and Yuan and Martin. It was a pretty sobering session there, I thought, between Nada's point that the relationship between the US and China could be even worse after the upcoming presidential election, and then Martin's point that we're at a period that's comparable to the end of the First and the end of the Second World Wars. I was a bit cheered up by Yuan, who pointed out that whatever happens, a new Cold War isn't really possible because of the economic entanglement between China and the West. And she said, and I never thought about this before, that of course China's so much more integrated into the world than Russia ever was. What did you take away from that?
Well, I mean, I come at all of these things through the lens of an investor, obviously being the personal finance person on the FT. But, I mean, in the previous session that I did with Merin earlier today, so many investors are really focused on China and particularly, growing companies in China, companies paying dividends in all emerging markets as the future hope. So, of course, all of this political overlay is very worrying for them as well. But then just on your final point about how integrated China is, a couple of our panels over the last few days have pointed out about the huge numbers of software engineers, which are basically China's biggest export, if you like, as trends like AI, artificial intelligence, just become even more popular. And so many of the people working for AI companies around the world, wherever they are, in the States, in Europe, are from China. That's where the expertise is coming from. So lots for us to be thinking about there. But
absolutely,
we are going to have a little bit of a segue now from China to fashion. Now, coming up, again, we are going to divide the audience. You have a choice. You can either go with Paul Smith or how to do a lunch with the FT. The choice is yours.